All right, we are live. Hello there, and welcome to the Deadly Analysis podcast. The film we are discussing tonight is called Antichrist. And if you haven't heard of it, it's all about Kirk Cameron defeating Nikolai Carpathia in an epic battle for souls during the end times. So if you're into that sort of thing, that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Actually, no, that's a very different film. The Antichrist film we will be discussing tonight is all about the primal apparatus that lies underneath human dynamics of sexuality and power and grief. It's about science and ecology and the sexes and power. And if we're being honest, the only reason we selected it was to see the size of William Dafoe's penis. I mean, that's like maybe 20% a joke. Maybe 20% a joke, at least for me. So yeah, suck it, Kirk Cameron. There was no cum blood in your film, so that's why we selected this one. So buckle up, grab your scissors, and let's cut into this psychosexual horror film and talk about what it's all about. Long story short, Antichrist is about a married couple, William Dafoe and Charlotte Gainsbourg. And while having sex, their infant son in a nearby room falls out of a window to his death. She, the lady, the woman in the film, they're not named, so she becomes distraught and is eventually hospitalized. But her husband, who's a psychiatrist, attempts to treat her. And deciding that she needs to face her fears, he takes her to a cabin in the woods where she spent a previous summer with the boy. Once they're there, she becomes more and more unhinged and starts essentially perpetuating sexual violence on herself and on her husband. So that's Antichrist. Very different than the Kirk Cameron's Left Behind series, in case you can't tell. Little different. So this film was our co-host Ben's selection, whose previous film choices for this podcast included The Witch, The Seventh Seal, and The Babadook, all of which are on our YouTube channel if you want to take a listen to those, and all of which I've noticed contain some amount of psychological components on the human condition, usually couched in a theological frame of reference. And surprise, surprise, this film is no different, right? We're about to enter Satan's church for a particular sort of reason, right? We're about to enter Eden and discuss the odd reversal that this film places on the idea of paradise. And so I kind of want to start off by thanking Ben for selecting this film. I hadn't seen this movie. I literally had not seen this movie until last week, until it was recommended to me. I had heard about it for years, but I was just terrified to watch it because I had heard there was no coming back from, the graphic violence and the genital mutilation and all of that. But that really wasn't what scared me in this movie, and it's not what kept me interested even. What kept me unsettled were really the ideas explored, and I'm hoping that's what we'll focus on tonight. This is not a horror movie for stupid people. This is not Annabelle 6, The Rise of Geppetto, right? This is not a dumb film. This is a smart film, and it's a graphic one, but one that raises questions about what it means to be a woman, what it means to have a nature, what nature itself actually is. Is it ordered? Is it chaotic? There's a kind of a lingering lens of depression and anxiety that may better help us understand and interpret everything. So there's a lot of stuff to discuss in this movie. And I think this movie may actually be one of two selections made by my other co-hosts that have just absolutely blown me away. So I'll start by saying I like this movie a lot. The other film ended up being Sunshine, which I think was Antonio's selection. I'd never seen Sunshine before this podcast, and I'd never seen Antichrist. And if this podcast ended next week, and it's not, so you better stay tuned, damn it. But even if it did, those two films alone have just made it all worthwhile to me. This film and then Sunshine, and I'll hopefully be able to explore why tonight with you guys. But I love the cinematic rules that this movie broke, which we can get into. I love the art piece of it. I love the power grab, the psychosexual violence, the rawness, and most importantly, the reflections that it offered by way of the human condition, things like grief and pain and despair. So I'll start, I guess, after that by throwing this over to Ben and ask why he selected Antichrist as his fourth film to discuss for this podcast. And maybe also what, Ben, I guess you think the themes that this film, what were some of the themes that this film centered on to you? One of the things I think is going to be hard to navigate in this movie is sort of the clusterfuck of symbolism that's everywhere, which I've noticed is also another theme in a lot of the films you select. Is just I think it's maybe one of my main criticisms of the film is that there's just so much. We could take one thing and just go into it for hours. So if you could kind of hone in on maybe one theme that this film centered in on to you, what would it be? And then why did you select this movie?
Absolutely. So I have to say that the reason that I picked this and that I wanted to pick this is just because I had this kind of reaction to it that I really don't have to a lot of films, right? So it's like I can really sort of intellectually appreciate a lot of different horror films, but this one is on a short list of films that I've seen that really kind of grab me in some way that it is sort of inexplicable. The other one, of course, being The Seventh Seal. This one not to such an extent, but there's something about it that really just spoke to me, and I'm not exactly sure what that is, but it really just it got under my skin, man. It really just sort of I don't know, there's something to it, there's a spark here. um Other than that, I think it is the way that it's shot, the way that it looks. There's just a lot of really interesting sort of visual stuff to explore here. And in terms of just the main themes, I really think it does come back to morality. The nature of morality and how that sort of clashes, I think, with our sort of almost what I want to call natural conceptions, but I don't think it is natural. I think something about our culture has shifted the way that we think about what good and evil is, and what kind of the natural process of life is, of what gender roles are, for instance, of children and the role that they play. Just there's a lot of unpacking to do, I think, and I might even throw that back to a Nietzschean place. But I mean, as you alluded to, it's so dense that it's really hard to grab onto one specific thing and say, okay, here's where we're going to start. Um, but yeah, like I just think there's really a lot here to discuss. And it's artistically vocal.
Yeah, what'll be interesting is maybe if we can. My goal, my own personal goal, is to maybe try and help you figure out like what that thing is, that thing that did it for you, right? I explored those same sorts of things in some of the films that have done it for me, where I'm like, why is this just leaves me with something? And after thinking about it for a long time, I realized they were particular things about the movie, particular ways things were shot, and then also the content. So for like It Follows, it was like, this really isn't a movie about sex. It's something's bothering me that's much different about it. And I thought about it and explored it. And it took me a little bit of thinking, and maybe some of the conversations that we had as a podcast, to go, yeah, that's why I'm fucking freaked out about it. So hopefully something like that'll happen. Let me maybe start by saying I'll throw out what I think this movie is about, and you guys tell me what you think. How about that? I'll give my 30-second, here's what I think this movie is about. I don't think necessarily it's about any one particular thing. That's it. There's tons of stuff in this movie, right? But if I could sort of, what spoke to me in this movie and thematically is something like the following. Nature is evil, right? Let's start there. Nature is evil. Nature is Satan's church, right? That's explicitly stated in this movie. We have these animals, the deer, the crow, and the fox. The fox explicitly telling us that chaos reigns, right? Which I thought was also one of the most powerful cinematic sequences in any of the films that we've selected. It was a crazy experience to watch that on my projector in the dark. That was just kind of, it left me very unsettled. I'll put it that way. So we have this idea that nature is evil, and that women are more in tune maybe with nature, are more susceptible to the evil because they're more open to nature. There's a scene where the Charlotte Gainsbourg actress says, nature controls the body of a woman. She uses nature towards the end of the film to find William Dafoe, and he's hiding in the foxhole. She hears the crow being beaten to death, which I thought was one of the weirdest scenes of the film. And she's listening. She's using nature to get what she needs, right? To essentially go and isolate her husband and to potentially kill her husband. The idea that the scene where she's melting into the green, you remember the scene where like they're going, I think it's as they're heading into Eden, into the cabin, and they're on the train, and she's walking along the forest, very like almost Lord of the Ringsian, and how scary and decrepit the forest is as she's walking through it. Very beautiful, very artsy. And there's a scene at the end of that where she melds and melts into nature, essentially like becoming one with a kind of natural evil, becoming evil, being enveloped in that evil. So nature's evil, women are more in tune with nature. And I think she realized this at Eden when she was there the summer before with her son. This is why her thesis becomes more gibberish. And there's a line in the movie where she's talking to William Dafoe, and she says that she came there to work on like understanding, I think it's gynocide. I'm saying that right, I hope. And she ends up buying the idea that women are evil to a certain extent. And so nature's evil. Women are more in tune with nature. She realizes this and embraces it. And what follows is essentially a psychosexual power grab, kind of an orgy of a lot of different symbolism and issues. But I think ultimately it comes down to the idea of like being enveloped in a kind of baser natural sense of self. It's almost like going back, like leaving culture, leaving the city, leaving normal life, and going to into a setting where all of that stuff is, for the most part, separated, segregated, and it's just you and your partner. And then exploring these very fundamental issues about who you are as a person, who the sexes are, how they interact with each other, and apparently one of them being more in tune with a kind of natural evil, sort of opposite of Eden. So that's sort of like, if I could, it's supposed to be a 30-second spiel, it's more like a 3-minute spiel. That's what I took the film to be about for the most part. What do you guys think?
I'll go. I don't know if I'm the only person who's a parent in this group. Am I the only parent? Okay. So this opening sequence has always been like way up there, like probably my favorite opening to a film ever. Not because that makes me feel good. It actually perfectly articulates every parent's greatest fear. Like, it is so perfectly articulated. And I've talked about this with a lot of people. When you become a parent, you become a really morbid, sick fuck. Your brain does crazy ass things. You start imagining the worst possible things happening to your kid, like finding their body on the side of the road in a ditch, or like a knife falling off of the counter and like going through their head. Like, you start to actually worry to the point where you get visual in your head about what could possibly happen. And I think there's something to that in making sure that our offspring is protected and taken care of, and that we make sure their fragile little bodies don't get injured. But when you watch a film like this and you see an opening like that, and the slow motion of it, and showing every single detail to show when you go through a traumatic event, that's kind of what happens in your head. Things go into slow motion. You notice every single little detail of everything. It perfectly shows what an event like that would be like to a parent, and how much guilt you would feel because of the activity that you were engaging in when it occurred. So for me, the opening alone, if it was just the opening as a film, would be enough to just scare the shit out of me. Like, I'd be like, okay, I'm done. Fuck this movie. But it's beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful. The cinematography in that sequence is amazing. Now, outside of that, the way it portrays women is it's a little interesting. I feel like when I was watching it, I was thinking of that George Carlin line where he says that men are dumb and women are crazy, but women are crazy because men are dumb. And I felt like that perfectly put a theme in for what this film is, because whenever you're having a problem, it seems like in the dynamic of a man and woman relationship, you have a guy that always is trying to fix your problems instead of listening to you and just like being someone that you can hold on to and just talk about stuff and get it off your chest. They're always trying to fix everything and be in control of the situation, and they're trying to be helpful, but they can tend to make things a little bit worse. And I think they went down that rabbit hole in a crazy, crazy fucked up way. But I think it was about relationships in my mind, and how fucked up a relationship can be when you go through a traumatic event together, and the steps that you go through when you go through a loss or an event like that. I know that there were other themes, but that's the one that stood out the most to me as a mother and someone in a married relationship. So I'm not sure what you guys took from it on those parts with relationship and children.
Look, just make sure you keep your window closed. That's my only advice after watching this movie. I know Kylie's much older, but still, windows closed. Share it.
We have a one-story house, so I think we're good. And honestly, as we were saying, I was watching it with some friends today for the second time, and we were saying this kind of stuff has actually happened, where children have fallen out of windows or fallen from bridges and things like that. And generally, when they're that young, they're very plastic. A lot of them survive from falls like that. It's when we get older that tends to kill you. But I mean, I'm sure you can still die from it. But kids are a lot more plastic. That's one of the weirdest things about being a parent, is finding out that your kids can go through the craziest of things, and they'll just get up and they're like, no problems here, and they won't have any injuries. Their bones like can handle it. So it was pretty messed up to show, like, it wasn't even that big of a drop and they killed him. I was like, damn. he probably could have survived that in real life.
That's really interesting that was the thing, the thing that struck you the most. I guess it's just that I don't have kids. It was the thing that struck me the least, which I think is really kind of cool. I mean, that's maybe the benefit of having so much symbolism and so many different things we could talk about in a movie like this, is that if you do have a background like yours, which is absolutely different than mine, you're able to go, that scared the shit out of me. And I'm going to go, well, I didn't do anything for me. Here's this other stuff. And I bet you that other stuff is the stuff you're going to go, you know, yeah, really. I mean, maybe that's the benefit of having kind of a clusterfuck of symbolism. I don't know. What else? What about the rest
with
of
everyone?
Yeah. And now I'm curious to hear everyone else's thoughts. What you guys like? What was this film about to you?
Guess I'll go next. I think there's a lot to talk about on this film, but I want to actually answer your question with a single sentence, Noah. Sex is bad. I think that's one of the big takeaways. Everything bad in this film surrounds sex in some way or another. It is, in a strange way, I think, if they could get over all the grotesqueness, a lot of conservative Christians would love the themes of this film, because it does sort of trace back to this idea that sex, especially when it's sort of primal and unbridled in that way, just ruins everything. Yeah, so that's, I think, the bottom line of it for me. Obviously, all the other themes I see there and I agree with, grief, relationships, evil as a primal force rather than sort of a human invention or an aspect of human nature. I see all that, and that's all legitimate, and I would love to unpack that. But for me, that was the thing that just jumped out the most. Sex is bad.
Which is interesting, because one of the notes I put down that I probably am not the first one to realize about this movie is that the opening scene where they're having sex, he kind of kills her at the end the same way they're having sex at the beginning. It's really weird. It's almost like there's a connection between sex and death. I mean, we talked about this in the It Follows podcast, just the conceptually, thematically, they're like, when you think of sex, it's almost inextricably interwoven with the idea of dying. You're bringing a being into the world that is eventually going to die. So sex and death are always sort of talking together. And in a lot of the films that we discuss, we see them interwoven, probably no much more so than in this one. And I thought it was just kind of odd that, like, the opening scene, have kind of just part of it of how they're having sex is kind of like how he kills her at the end. It's a very different. So yeah, those are definitely connected in this. So basically what I'm realizing is we need to send this movie to a bunch of evangelical Christians, get their sign off. We'll send it to 1,000,000dads, 1,000,000moms.com, and say, this is not a bad film. It actually should be sent to churches everywhere in order to make sure people don't fornicate. Yeah, I agree. I'm gonna do it right after this.
Yeah, good luck on getting a bunch of million dads, million moms to watch a film called Antichrist. That's going to be a tough sell there, Noah. Yeah, see, I did want to go last because everything that all of you said, I think, is absolutely right. I think this film is about how sex is bad. I think it's about how parenting is scary. I think it's about how nature is evil and women. That's actually a very particular plot point in the second act of the film. I think all of those things are true. In many cases, I do my glib line of, "Oh, that's interesting. I'd like to see a movie about that." When I'm trying to, knock down a film and at the same time sort of acknowledge a person's interpretation of, or respond to a person's interpretation of a film. But in this case, I can't say I'd like to see a movie about that, because Antichrist is about all the things that you said it is. What gets me about this film, and I'm gonna be once again the negative voice in the room as per my role, and Noah will once again search for the ban button. So first I will, before I do that, I must say that I agree with Ben when he says this film is incredibly well shot. There are some scenes in here that if you just, every frame of painting, right? If you had taken just that frame and put it on my wall, I'd be really happy. Well, some of them I wouldn't want on my wall, but others are absolutely beautiful, especially when Charlotte Gainsbourg is walking toward the house, toward Eden, and even some of the scenes where the poor child is frolicking before he falls. Those are this is incredibly well shot. Lars von Trier is fantastic with cinematography. Noah, you're going to see that later when you watch Melancholia. You're going to see some beautiful shots that you'd want to put up on your wall. That said, after I've seen the majority of Lars von Trier's major films. This one, Antichrist, is actually the beginning of what's called like the Depression trilogy. It's Antichrist, Melancholia, and Nymphomaniac, volumes 1 and 2, which he combines into one movie. Very Kill Billy of him. So this is part of the Depression trilogy. So I think he is, he's talking about depression. He's talking about trying to capture on film what it's like to be depressed, or what it's like to, in this case, in one scene, to have a panic attack. And I've watched the Depression trilogy. I've watched his earlier films, Dancer in the Dark, and on and on and on. And when I finished Nymphomaniac, I watched Nymphomaniac volumes 1 and 2. So this is about 5 straight hours of Lars von Trier. I thought to myself that this man exists in a completely separate universe from me. That this man has never felt a happy moment in his entire life. And that that there has never been a loving touch, a nice smile. No one's asked him how his day was. No human kindness has touched this man from beginning to now. And so as I look back on Antichrist and I watched it for the last time. This is my last Lars von Trier film. As I watched it again, I felt that there was something so inhuman about the filmmaking, and I don't mean that I mean that in the sense that that I almost no longer have a relationship to these films, that I can't relate to them in any way, that it's so external, because it's just so unrelenting in its depression and unrelenting in its desire to make me feel like shit. And so that's I think that one of the weaknesses of this film, and one of the weaknesses of Lars von Trier's work as a whole, is that I think that in order for good horror to work, in order for good drama to work, there has to be some sort of identification between the audience and the characters, the audience and the story. I have to be able to root for something, or I have to be able to see myself in something. I have to see some sort of human relationship. And at the end of Nymphomaniac, I'm not going to spoil the film, but at the end of the Nymphomaniac, literally every single person in that film turns out to be a complete and total fuckwad. And I can't, it's at that moment that I felt that there's something extra outside of human experiences, outside of my ability to identify with it. And the same thing happened today when I rewatched Antichrist for the last time. It's this unrelenting wave after wave after wave of depression and anxiety, and it's effective and it works. So in that sense, I'm giving the film credit, but it's also something that I'm not able to sort of latch on to anything. And it, of course, culminates in a woman cutting her clit off. So at that point, I'm like, all right, well, fuck this. But yeah, I'll sort of turn it over to Ben. I think you said you had something on this. So
there's definitely something that I wanted to sort of interject here. I think you're spot on. I haven't seen his other work, and so I think that would give a lot of context, and you have a lot of sort of background to play into this to sort of explain why he did some of the things that he did and some of the decisions that he made, that you can sort of correlate to other films. But for this in particular, I think it's quite apropos to say that there's something inhuman about it, because I do think that's kind of the point. And so whenever you say this movie is about how this is bad and how nature is evil, I think that's totally flipped. There's a line in the middle of this film where Willem Dafoe says quite perfectly that it is the mind that distorts reality, not the other way around. And so like this entire conception of evil and how this is bad and how this is depressing and how you see this certain thing and it makes you feel this certain way, that's totally within you. That's not in nature. It's you that's doing it to yourself. And it was her that was doing it to sort of, I think, herself to an extent. When you interpret kind of like the life and death cycle in that particular way, you throughout the entire film you have these scenes where you have a doe and her dead child sort of like hanging from her body, or you have the fox eating itself, or you have the bird that falls from the tree and like the ants kind of get it, and then the hawk comes down and picks it up and eats it himself. Like there's all this twisted stuff, but the interpretation of that I think comes from us. And so to point out the difference between the human perspective and the natural perspective is the entire idea, I think.
Basically, you're too happy a person, Jim. Get some depression in your life,
Oh,
God.
I have a negative view of life. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm a pretty hopeless person, but this is just too much for even me. It's insane. There's not a redeemable quality to anything in a Lars von Trier film. I mean, you might as well take Xanax or any sort of antidepressant before you start watching this film, because you're going to need it afterwards. I think, yeah, I think you're right. Yes, in terms of, I realize that this is me and my interpretations on this film. I get that. And I get that nature, red in tooth and claw, to quote Tennyson, it's almost objective, right? It's outside of our human value system. I get that, but he is also dealing with human characters here, right? And he's trying to say something about gender and society and the nature of man. If this was just a 2-hour nature documentary of wolves eating themselves and ants eating birds, then I would certainly get your interpretation. But I think the bulk of this movie is also about these two characters and how they relate to each other and how they literally have no redeemable quality. I mean, Willem Dafoe's character's inability to understand Charlotte Gainsbourg's emotional state, his complete medical malpractice of trying to treat his wife, her doing like anything that she does in this movie, all of these are bad people acting badly. So as much as I agree with what you're saying, Ben, about how the film is presenting a sort of that a lot of my complaints are interpretive, that they're within me, the viewer, not within the subject matter of the film. I can see that point, but I think there are other elements that we need to take into account here as well, right?
So you didn't see any hope or love in this film in any way, shape, or form?
I did. So there's the one scene where they're sort of, I think they had just had sex and they're sort of tickling each other, and that moment, I thought that was, yeah, I did, but that's like 5 minutes, and reminder, she shoves a log into his erect penis later on, and then, well,
yeah, I mean, obviously they're toxic, but one of the most
and
interesting,
she's kind enough to finish him off.
yeah, that scene is. I don't know how you guys sat through that. When I was watching it, I was like, "Oh, the poor guys." That's pretty intense.
That was the most hopeful moment for me. I was like, "Oh,
he at least got to come."
Yeah, so nice of him.
No,
Again,
but like,
sex is bad. We'll come back to that theme. But no, I wanted to sort of echo what Jim is saying, because in some ways I agree with you, Jim. In some ways I don't. Overall, I did not like this film. Again, I think it's gorgeous. It's, it's fantastically shot, and I like the themes. I like the ideas that it's trying to explore, but I don't think it does a terribly good job of actually exploring them. But for different reasons than you, Jim. For me, I don't have to identify with any of the characters. I don't have to necessarily sense that there's humanity in them. I think there's lots of movies that I love that fail those conditions. For me, it's what threw me off more than anything else is it seemed like the film couldn't quite decide how it wanted to approach the material. There was aspects of it that were surreal. I mean, the fox saying chaos reigns, for example. I mean, that's like something straight out of a dream sequence. But the film never suggests that it is a dream sequence, and the film never suggests that Willem Dafoe has any reaction to this at all. It's like, oh, okay, well, the fox is eating itself, and it says chaos reigns. Okay, like you do, just another day. And if the whole film would be, or like the whole third act had been like that, that could have worked. But instead, it just sort of dropped that and then, went off in an otherwise sort of realistic fashion. Something similar with her sort of psychological breakdown. I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I don't know of any sort of condition, I think, that would arise out of grief in such a way that would manifest itself in that kind of homicidal mania. I mean, I can totally understand her going crazy. I can totally understand her hating her husband and taking it out on her husband, and even this bizarre sort of sexual sort of aggressiveness mixed with the crying. All that made sense, but she has, she wants to kill him and she wants to help him, and she's, I mean, that kind of sort of schizophrenic. I mean, I know that's sort of not in vogue anymore as a diagnosis, but it's the only word I can think of to apply for it. As a response to grief, just psychologically, to me, is something that doesn't make sense. There's lots of films, I think, which explore the dark side of human psychology in a way that makes sense. Bug is a film I think we have coming up, if I'm not mistaken, is one that does a fantastic job, I think, of exploring human psychology in a very realistic way. But in spite of the fact that, I mean, the film was trying to talk about that, I just think it didn't know how to do it, or it couldn't decide how it wanted to do it.
So, my interpretation, I think there's an important moment in the film where she's in the hospital after she had passed out after the funeral. And you see these beautiful flowers in a vase, but there's something in the vase, and it slowly closes up on that vase. And I think that is the symbolism of the entirety of the film. Like they do have a beautiful, loving, hopeful, wonderful relationship, but this sickness has happened to them, and it's going to take them over. Now, as far as her completely going batshit in a way that I honestly have never seen any, I don't know of any diagnosis that she would have, but I think that a lot of the problem came from her husband working on her for so long before they go to this place that she's deathly afraid of. And he was hypnotizing her. He was making her hallucinate. And as far as the hallucination and reality thing, it gave me that Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas kind of vibe, where there's some reality, but then there's some that's like alligators, like hanging out in a bar. Like this can't be real. So it was kind of, it gave me that vibe where, I don't know if you guys noticed when she was running through the forest, at times the world would get kind of swirly at places, and I started to feel like I was losing my fucking mind. And I think that was what he was going for. I think he was trying to make me crazy, and he did. Like, I was triggered by this film, and I felt insane watching it.
To add to that, I think just the Dogma 95 shit added to this, right? So you have these elements where everything is so cinematic and gorgeous, filmed in high res, slow motion, slow capture film, like the intro. And then you have these other sequences that are just so obviously handheld that to like have those together, I think maybe somewhere near a criticism that Garrett is lodging cinematically, that it's just kind of, what do you want to do here? Like, where's the connecting points? Didn't bother me maybe as much as Garrett. I kind of dug it. I thought it was a little weird to have Dogma 95, handheld, all that stuff never really was anything I knew till I watched this movie. I'm still very new to this. And so it was kind of interesting. It was more interesting than it was annoying, I guess. But I can see that as a criticism cinematically that maybe kind of echoes what Garrett is talking about thematically in the film. So I get that. The other thing to think about is maybe my interpretation has a little bit of explanatory power here when we think of nature being the evil thing, the bad thing. So we have this woman coming back into nature, and yeah, her actions don't make sense. And there's a scene where she wants him to, you're going to leave me. Remember that scene at the end where she's violently attacking him, but then she wants him back. You're going to leave me. And there's a sense in which I think going into the forest, going into Eden, reverts the person right? I think the idea somewhere sitting around there is the idea that like it reverts the person into a more base state where like emotions like fear just are acted upon in a raw way, that they're unhinged essentially, that it's almost like going back to a more natural, more base, more raw state. And so that's how she's acting out. So it's not going to make as much sense to us because we're coming at this with like rules and logic and societal norms. And that doesn't make sense. Why does she want him back? And then she wants to kill him. And then she wants to jam this thing through him. Like, you got to think about it, you know, from the perspective of her wanting to, she thinks he's going to leave her now, I guess. And so that's why she jams that thing into him. So he can't move. He can't walk. You know, but that's a horrible way to respond to what, you know, you think someone's going to leave you, but it's a raw, brute, basic cavemanish way to react to a fundamental fear that we all have, even in a very, you know, in a society, essentially, with rules and with regulations and things. There's almost a realization of no one's behind the curtain in this film, a reversal of things when you go into the woods, which I kind of dug. Reminded me a little bit also of Mother. I don't get just the base nature of this film in a lot of ways. The fact that the characters aren't named, that they're isolated, they're in a cabin in the woods. Anytime you start to see these things in a film, particularly a horror film, to me, I always get the idea that there's going to be a focus on a very fundamental, basic concept. If the characters aren't named, like let's take Mother as an example that came out recently, he and she. And I get the idea that there's going to be a very black and white stripping away of all of these other things that the director and the writer doesn't want you to focus on. And we need to focus on this fundamental thing, whatever it is, whatever it's going to be explored in the film. And I got that early on in this movie. And I think, to me, I think that sort of makes sense given my interpretation. I think you always have to go back to the idea that this is a reversal. We think of nature as this serene, great place that we escape society from, that we go to have serenity and peace. But you have to look at this film from the lens of everything being the opposite. The lens has to not be happy. It's depression, right? We all know the story of Lars von Trier being depressed when he made this film. Whether that's true or not is conjecture. I've heard a lot of people like Mark Kermode say it's bullshit. And then William Dafoe, who worked on the film, say no, it was absolutely true. He was absolutely depressed during this film. So you have to approach the film from the lens of depression, which may speak to Jim's interpretation, and then also from the fact that every typical thing is reversed in here. You know, nature's not good. It's bad. It hurts you. The Garden of Eden wasn't a good place. It was Satan's church, right? You have to sort of like rework your brain in a lot of respects to make this film make sense. And I don't know if that's a criticism or not. And now I actually have no idea what I'm saying. I feel like I've trailed so far off. Thanks, Lars.
I think you're right on. I think everything you're saying is right. And also, in point of fact, you talked in the beginning about Dogma 95, Breaking the Waves. One of his early film was a typical Dogma 95 film. So he's rooted in that tradition. He's rooted in these realistic portrayals. And then, of course, Antichrist and some of his Dancer in the Dark, Antichrist, some of his later work has been a little bit more metaphorical, a little bit more expressionist. All of that is true. Like the reversals, everything you're saying is right. I think at the end of the day, though, from my experience with his movies, and perhaps this is solely an idiosyncratic thing, from my experience in his movies, I'm not going to be able to rescue the experience, the very uncomfortable experience of watching his films by an intellectual theme. I'm not going to be able to say, oh, but then this is what he was exploring and I learned XYZ, so it was okay that I watched her shove a log into his penis. Like that's, I think at the end of the day, I end up criticizing these films, Antichrist and Nymphomaniac and some of his later work, based upon the sensationalism, not based upon the ideas in them. I think many of the ideas are really cool, and I think many of the at the end of this, we'll see that I've sort of fallen to the middle on the quality of this film, because I think it's effective, even though I think that it's a lot of sensationalism. And it's a lot of jarring images for the sake of jarring in many cases.
I don't know if I'm gonna be able to. I don't know. That doesn't sit with me completely well. I know that there's a lot of horror out there that does that uses violence for the sake of violence, and that really becomes the central theme of the movie. And I really enjoyed this because I think that kind of wasn't what they did. Yeah, I mean there's a lot of really intense scenes where, you know, there's like one thing that happens and it blows your mind and it gets under your skin and it curdles your blood. And like there's a few times that this happens, but I really don't find that central. I think he included those moments to highlight other aspects of the movie, and maybe they were so sharp and so powerful that they might seem a little bit overwhelming or a little bit garish. You know, I don't know. It's really hard to put words around some of the scenes, you know, that you're talking about here. But as a piece of art, and I think I would consider it that because it's I don't know. I think I would consider it that because it moved me. I don't think it's supposed to make you comfortable or happy, or, you know, it's supposed to leave you hopeful. You know, this is horror, and I think it's extremely effective, really well done horror, because they do use violence, but in the right way.
I'm not denying that it's art. Like, please don't misunderstand it. Like, I'm not denying its artistic merits. I'm not denying that it's effective. I'm not denying its artistry, and I'm not denying the fact that it was well done in its use of violence. What I'm saying, and I'm going to go back to, I guess, the point that I was making at the beginning of when I first started talking. I think it exists in another realm that has very little relationship to ours. Does that make sense?
I may disagree with that a little. I get what you're saying, but I don't think it's a world that's separate from ours. I think it's probably a world that's separate from yours. I didn't feel that in this, Jim, and I live a fairly normal life. My penis is still intact. It's not bloody. You know, the plumbing works for the most part. There's no violence going on. But this film had, I think, a very similar thing it did to me that it did to Ben, and it spoke to me in a way that I had to have some connection here to the characters and to the story, and to feel it, to have the emotions that I had when I watched it, right? And I get what you're saying. I've had your experience in other films that are fairly popular, even that are well known for having that emotional connection. So I think that with different people, with other people, and I get the criticism, but I don't think the criticism is necessary. It goes back to Ben's point. I think the criticism is more your disconnect with it, which makes sense given that no one can experience the life of Jim other than Jim. But I didn't get anything like that. I could understand and empathize in a way that made me connect with the characters. I wasn't detached in any way in this movie with the characters. Very interesting that you felt so detached to it. You know, and there could be very personal reasons why that's the case between all of us. Very interesting to explore that. But yeah, for me, just the depression pieces, I guess, of Von Trier is what I'm looking forward to the most. I mean, maybe you had mentioned that these are the things that are like, oh, come on, like it's enough of Lars von Trier because of these things. And to me, that's the reason I want to now watch these other movies. I know it sounds strange. Like, that's the appeal to me to go see Melancholia, for example, which I had no idea existed, to be frank with you. I think my wife had mentioned it a long time ago, wanting to see it. And I was just like, yeah, you know, Kristen Dunst, whatever. She hasn't done anything good since I was being an asshole. And now I really want to see it, right? And I think part of the work there is the fact that this resonated with me, and maybe more of my cynical, nihilistic, darker areas of my world. You know, maybe the anti-Christian part of me, the removal of that from my life. Maybe there's an appeal there for me that makes me more susceptible to not necessarily understanding, but enjoying it. I maybe sound awful, but I don't know. Basically this is the long way around me saying I get your criticism, but I don't think it applies. I don't want to speak for everybody, but I don't think it applies to everybody here. It may apply to some people, but it may just be the person, you know?
So,
Sure.
can I just say, I don't know if you guys have possibly thought about this part of the film. This is The Lion King, but in a scarier version. So it's about the circle of life, and like, we are self-destructive. We tend to, well, all of us only survive and live off of the death of others. And I know that everybody like tries to glorify Mufasa sitting with his son and being like, this is a wonderful, happy thing. And I'm like, this is a fucked up thing to be talking to your kid about. Like, and they even show elements of this in the film when you see the tree when she starts masturbating and then he fucks her. You see when they back up, you'll see that there's all these dead bodies under the tree. Everything that's alive is alive because something died for it, and lots of things die for it. And this could even be seen as something that might explain why veganism might be a more moralistic, approach to life. I know Garrett probably like that, but it does show that even vegans, they're eating vegetables and fruits and living things. And you even see this at the end when his wife dies. He's like out in the forest, like foraging the berries, like the fruits of her like death that went into the earth. And so like it's all about the circle of life, but it's a really fucked up version of it. And you also see this with the nature attacking their safe place. That's what the house is. It's their safe spot. It's their safe house. It's getting attacked by all these acorns. And I was watching it with some close friends, and my friend Tony was like, I don't see why she's interpreting such horrible things from this. Acorns are great. They're fruit, and they go in the earth and things grow from it. It's a happy thing. And I'm like, yeah, but the way she's seeing it is they're all falling and dying. Like only one of them survives and makes a person. Like all of it is like falling dead things, just like what happened to her child. And he's like, I don't like the way this woman thinks. Like it made him really uncomfortable. He was like, I don't like this. But it's the circle of life. Things live and they die. And a lot of things die for us to live. And so I think that's what makes it super fucked, and also really super consistent throughout the entirety of the film. So I know it's weird to say this is like The Lion King, but it kind of is.
So, Sherry, with that comment, you somewhat undercut what I was going to say a second ago, because I in particular, that one image again, which was just fantastic with all the corpses under the tree. I mean, I think that's on the poster, if I'm not mistaken, and it's an amazing image. But what I was going to ask before you brought that up was, I was going to ask you guys to imagine if you decoupled the films, again, which I think we all are in agreement with, the unambiguously artistic merit of the cinematography and the editing and so forth. If you take that out of the film and just leave behind the characters and the story, and I want to ask if those of you who found it moving, if you think you'd still find it moving, because when I view this as a purely aesthetic object, it's very moving. Yeah, but when I focus in on the characters and the story, it does nothing for me. Now, I guess I share by bringing up the point that the way that image is so deeply tied into the themes, which it's harder for me to make that criticism now. So I kind of have to dial back on that myself. It might not be possible to decouple those two things. But in as much as it is possible, again, I don't find the characters compelling. I find the themes interesting and the visuals interesting, but the characters and the story, not so much.
Well, the characters and story, if that's what we're going to focus on, it's fairly basic, right? It's a cabin in the woods story. It's an isolation story, right? It's a dynamic. It's a story about the dynamics between a particular couple that are suffering grief. I mean, I would still find merit in it, I guess, Garrett. It would certainly remove a lot of the pieces of the film that I found beautiful, fantastic, enjoyable, that made it what it is. But I would still think there was enough meat there. I know you're a vegan, Garrett. Fuck, that was the wrong. There's enough there to chew on. Yeah, there's enough. Yeah, there's enough veggies there to chew on, I think, to have a conversation about, to have an interesting discussion about, the phrase we always use here is to put a stone in your shoe and make you think about things. Maybe that goes back to the themes that you were discussing. It certainly would be a less fantastic film, but it would be a film that I still think would be worth my time and would be interesting, and that I'd still be connected to. I think even I'd be interested enough at least to pursue. It wouldn't take that away from me. I hope that answers your question.
It is also difficult to, in a medium such as film, it's difficult to uncouple the story, the characters, the visuals. In a good film, all of them, all elements of the film, art direction, cinematography, etc., it all sort of it funnels into the same theme. So in that sense, some of the thought experiment that you're asking us to perform in many ways, Garrett, is almost impossible.
Well, he is a philosopher, so Yeah.
I mean, and so of course, as a philosopher, he's got to propose thought experiments that we can't do anything with. No, I also wanted to go back to some of the things you were saying, Noah. You were talking about, oh, I lost it. What were you saying right before Shayra talked about the
My Lion King analogy
King.
messed everybody
Lion
up.
King. No, actually, the Lion King sort of. You're absolutely right. It sort of threw my brain for a loop. I'm like, oh. And then Noah's joke in the chat. I don't know if you want to say that one out loud there, Noah. That was that drove me. Anyway, I guess I lost it, so I'll respond to it some other time.
Well, if I could, I want to say something about this thought experiment we're doing. So, all right, what I'm trying to do here to engage in that is to imagine myself reading this as if it were a book. So let's say I have the Antichrist novel in my hands, and I'm trying to read this, and I think some of the more twisted, messed up kind of like imagery might even be better if I were to read it and like maybe play it out in my own imagination. That aside. I think the characters themselves really, to me, are sort of like abstract and kind of like stripped away enough to be really representative of themes. And so if I were to say, okay, well, you know, I'm reading the character him or he, and how am I interpreting what his actions are? I think I would do that in probably sort of a metaphorical way. And the way that their power relationship plays out, I kind of think there would still be enough there to be interesting, probably more focused in a particular way as opposed to the whole of the movie, you know, as interesting as it is. But I think there is still something there in that regard.
No, Ben, I think that's a fantastic, that opened up all sorts of stuff in my head as I heard you said that. And it ties back into Jim's point about how you can't decouple them. Maybe this is a way of putting my criticism is that they don't really seem like characters. They don't exist or stand on their own as characters. They are just embodiments of themes or, you know, problems of society, problems with gender relations and so forth. They're serving a function in the story to put forward those themes rather than letting the themes come from a place of actual, real, humanistic character. That itself actually might be a pretty good way of rephrasing what my concern here.
I actually have a different interpretation of it. I don't think that they are characters. I think there's a main character, which is nature, and they're just vessels to express what nature is, which is chaos. So I don't even actually see them. And that might be why she's so all over the place and he's so all over the place, and why at times they're like, I love you. And then they're like, wow. I think it's just they're vessels for whatever is going on in nature. And I think it's expressed when, I don't know if you guys remember this, when the cinematography went from down below with all the scariness that's happening, and all of a sudden it just shoots up in the sky and you just see all the tops of the trees and it looks fine. It looks calm. It looks like nothing's really happening, but we all know what's happening under that canopy because we've been watching under the canopy for a while. And I think it's their way of expressing, like, there's so much chaos and so many crazy things going on underneath the canopy that we might see on the surface. It's perfectly beautiful, but when we really get down to the nitty gritty of what's going on in the world, it's fucked. And I think they're just vessels for themes, as you say, but for what nature is.
To add to that, Shayra, the scene that struck me that may be very to your point is the scene where you're seeing Defoe being essentially rained black and white on acorns raining all around him. It's almost like there's this idea that like we're enveloped in nature. And there's even I think even there's a scene in the film where they say that nature is in us. Like, it's not just nature. We have a nature. Nature is in us. And you see, you know, this idea of like acorns raining around you. It's everything, right? You're a part of nature. Nature is all consuming, right? And which I think goes to your point that maybe we should be looking at these two people less as characters and more as vessels of a kind of chaotic and dare we say evil reversed form of nature. You know, maybe a more fundamental form of nature. I mean, there's a lot of support for this theologically. One of the things I want to ask you guys that may segue into this is why the film is even called Antichrist. Like, why call it Antichrist? Let's just explore that. Why call it Antichrist, right? I mean, I'll throw that out there.
Isn't nature doesn't she say nature is Satan's church? Yes, nature is Satan's church. And so Antichrist would be nature, right?
No. The Antichrist is women. I mean, again, when you look at the typography for
you're right.
The T in Christ is the female for women, and I was reflecting on it at the end of the film, and it occurred to me that actually, technically speaking, I suppose if you were to have an actual Antichrist, someone that was the exact opposite of Christ in every possible way, it would have to be a woman. You know, Christ would be man, Antichrist would have to be woman. But that having been said, well, I think that's kind of clever and interesting. I don't. Most of the film, I was thinking this film should be called Nymphomaniac, because that's, you know, that seems to be what's actually going on here.
That's really interesting.
I think with the women being the Antichrist, I think that is so important to talk about, because the main ending scene, you know, in the end of a bad horror scary movie, there's always that scene where, let's say for like Carrie, where she goes to the grave where the house is, and then like a hand shoots up. The hand shoots up moment was a bunch of faceless women coming at him. And that's so fucking important. So fucking important. And I know that this must have resonated with Noah, because we've talked about his faceless people. Almost all of his movies have like a blurred face person. And I see all these faceless women coming at him, and I'm like, uh-oh, this might be something that will be unsettling to Noah.
It's both unsettling and oddly gratifying in some ways. But yes, it was, yes, absolutely. Very scary.
But yeah, women, it shows that women are ultimately the ones that are going to harness the power of this chaotic nature. And they're going to use it in however they need to, I guess, reverse things or to set things the way they want to set them. But I mean, she doesn't really have an organized thing that she's doing, or does she? You know, that's the real thing. It seems, you know how you guys were saying she's all over the place, but at one point she was crying and like holding him and crying, and then talks about like never trust a crying woman. She's a manipulative woman. And it just goes down to how much of this was her acting and how much of this was her like maybe even setting this up to do this to him, to put him in this position.
But see, that I think that goes back to my interpretation wins. I'm just gonna be honest with you and throw this out here. I'm just gonna keep being an apologist for my interpretation. I think mine explains a little bit of that, right? So let me unpack it really fast, right? If we unpack the idea that nature is bad, and the closer you get to nature, the more bad you become. If you're more susceptible to it, you're a woman. Yada yada yada. The desires you have, the fears you have, they manifest in ways that don't make sense and are more raw, and it can even be contradictory, such that in one moment you're don't leave me, and then another moment you're like, ha ha ha, you know, like that's, you shouldn't trust me. What if this doesn't end well? Or she makes some statement like that, like what if this, I forget the exact quote, but it's like something like, what if we're not going to be together? Or what if this doesn't end well? Something very for like bad, something awful. But I think Garrett, I thought it was called Antichrist, not necessarily because women necessarily are bad. That's definitely part of this. I think that's part of the equation that this film is offering us. But I think it's more of like an exploration of the raw self, and that rawness becomes more manifest as you leave society, go into nature, and the fears that you have, one in which is grief, and these emotions that you have, not necessarily fears, these emotions that you have become more of a plaything in Satan's church. So they're clearly going through this immense grief, the most immense grief you can go through, right? The loss of a child, in a setting where evil is prone to just pop up and take over and take hold, according to the movie. And so, the film is called Antichrist because the idea of a raw self, raw nature, be who you are, is antithetical to the idea of Christ in a lot of ways. And Ben, this may be the Nietzschean thing that we throw into this. It's the authentic self is the Antichrist. It is instead of your desires, replace them with these virtues. Instead of the things that you want, you can't get these particular things. So let's call them virtues. Let's build them up, and let's prop up eventually what becomes the totality of an entire religious apparatus known as Christianity, right? This is a very Christian film in a lot of ways. And I think the idea of Antichrist is the reversal of that kind of evaluation onto a palette that's just a raw person, a raw self, raw desire, raw fear, raw emotion, which is brought out in a setting like nature that is Satan's playground, right? It's called Satan's playground. Nature is called Satan's church in this movie because nature is the place where you're your most authentic and most raw, and societal conventions and virtues and the liabilities of acting in ways that are bad are all removed to a certain extent, right? To me, that's why it was called Antichrist. It's one person letting that take hold. Didn't necessarily even need to be the woman. I even go so far as to say that, but the woman, according to this film, is more in tune with that sort of evil, that sort of nature, that sort of raw, organic. This is me. This is who we are at our base, right? And we've grown out of it, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, by being conventional and societal. I hope that makes sense. So that's kind of how I kind of went one step further. Then it's not just woman is evil; it's nature's evil, and women are more in tune with nature, so they're the more susceptible people to it. And I think that also explains the ending, with all the women who've maybe died in the past with their faces blurred out. These are all the women who were truly more in tune with nature and more evil, which, if this interpretation is accurate, is kind of a shitty thing from Lars von Trier. I mean, I don't know how to really cash that out. Like Lars von Trier must really not like women, I guess,
Well,
in my interpretation.
I mean, in preparation for this film, he hired a journalist to study misogyny. He wanted to make a film about misogyny as well. So
I did not know that.
There is some background associated with him trying to explore the themes of misogyny with this. And I like your interpretation. I want to throw. I guess I want to throw a question at you, and even the Nietzschean interpretation that Ben seems to be proffering as well. Or I think you've got a confused look on your face, Ben. Maybe I put words in your mouth.
He probably has a different Nietzschean interpretation than mine, I would imagine.
Okay, all right. Well, I mean, what the wrench I want to throw is that Willem Dafoe's character always talks about rationality and how the rational mind is the thing that's gonna rescue her. So there's the one exercise he puts her through where he says, I'm gonna say the things that make you afraid, and then you be the rational person, and you argue against yourself. So essentially, he is trying to say that rationality is the thing that's going to prevent you from being this complete state of nature. How does that sort of impact or affect your?
I think that's totally in line with it, and the reason for that is if we understand a woman, as if the film is trying to tell us that a woman is, for lack of a better phrase, one step closer to the nature, and nature is evil, then of course he's going to be, in almost all circumstances, the voice of reason that tries to pull her out from that raw state. Like if we understand the distinction between raw, visceral, reactive emotion, authenticity of one's just, I hate to say who one is because that doesn't really capture it, but just the sort of viscerality of the immediate and what you want, desire, fear, all of those things. If that's more open to a woman, then of course it's going to be the man who says, use this other tool, this tool that's more conventional, right? Use this use logic. Come on. I mean, and that's entirely separate from the conversation about misogyny, because that is entirely misogynistic in a lot of ways, right? I read some feminist critique online about this film that says it's just one giant attempt at mansplaining and it's just one giant attempt for the man to have to lord over masculine knowledge over a kind of feminine knowledge, right? So this film has been cast in a lot of ways one step further than what I'm propagating, right? The idea that nature is evil, women are more in tune with nature, but that men still know better, right? Because they're removed from that. It's better for them. It's bad that women are so in tune with nature. Men are one step removed from it, and so of course they're going to utilize the tools of logic and reason and rationality, and that's sort of what the film is propagating. So I don't think I think actually is in line with my interpretation, right? Does that make sense?
It
Yes,
does,
it does.
but I mean, I kind of got to mansplain that mansplanation back to you, Noah, because it seems
mansplain away.
I thought that was there, but I thought it was clearly critiquing that. He's trying to rationalize away her depression and so forth and treat her with this sort of analytic method. And it clearly doesn't work. I mean, it's the colossal failure of that, which is what the film strikes you in the face with. So it's showing that in a way that's deeply critical of it. I mean, the mansplaining is there, and it shows what a terrible idea mansplaining is, at least when it comes to, something like grief or therapy or sort of deep and profound emotions.
I guess
I agree
true.
with Garrett. I agree with Garrett 100%. And here's why. When you watch it as a woman, I am like, that motherfucker, I've been with that motherfucker multiple times. I've broke up with that motherfucker multiple times. And it's this idea that they can fix everything. And people try to write it up as good intentions, but it's not. And what ends up happening is that guy ends up a victim of his own fucking bullshit. And then he acts like, oh, woe is me. Oh, woe is me. And hides. And, but you did it to yourself. And that's why I brought up the whole George Carlin quote in, about how men can do some dumb things and it can cause women to react to it. And I don't think that her reaction is necessarily on par with what most women react like. But I guess for me, it makes sense because I've been that crazy person, maybe not on that level, but I've had guys get me to the level where I'm like, that's not me. Like, I don't act that way. I don't behave that way. They've made me lose a bit of myself and I'm out of character at this point. So
I get that. And I get what you're saying, Garrett. At the same time, I think maybe the wrench in that, maybe something we may want to think about his actions as, if we think about the way he's talking with her, the way he's treating her as a way of him working out his own grief, I feel like that may change the interpretation here a little bit. I mean, I'll actually quote you. I pulled a quote from a feminist critique on this that says, that may have something to do with what we're talking about here. It says, the film is about the sympathetic murder by Defoe of the wife who is depicted as supernaturally evil, rationalizing the deed as crisis solution for a threatened patriarchal establishment. God damn. Does that sound intense?
So I have a question.
Okay.
Who murdered in this film?
Simba was clearly murdered. No, wait, that's a different. No, the man did.
And how many times?
I mean,
I think
he doesn't.
How many times
kill
does he go
the
to,
bird.
I he doesn't kill him, but he tries to multiple times. He gets murderous. I think that's an important place to go to with understanding where they're coming from, or at least where I think Lars was trying to go to with this, because I feel like this was showing that the MRA type of viewpoint is really fucking stupid.
Look, I just feel bad for the crow. I just feel bad for that crow.
I know, right? Well, and I also feel bad for, even though she went completely batshit crazy, like she was choked to death and killed by him. And I could see that there was grief on his face about having to do so, but he felt like it was necessary to do. I think it boils down to the fact that when we are trying to interact with one another, our differences can cause some serious conflict. And I think that's why there's the genital mutilation that occurs and the bashing of the dick and things like that. It's a conflict of the sexes. It's always been around. And they're just literally duking it out and battling their genitals. But then there's also the self-deprecation, the self-mutilation, the self-attacks. I think both the man and the woman tended to do bad things, but also did bad things to themselves, tend to be victims of their own bullshit. And I don't see it as necessarily pro being a misogynistic asshole in any way, shape, or form. Like, I guess I just don't see it that way at all. I just see it as some bad situations getting worse and worse and worse based off of our conflicts with one another.
No, I definitely think it would show that kind of person being in the negative role. I mean, if you call this Antichrist, then you have to kind of consider what is it that they're calling Christ. This is anti from the pro perspective. And I think that pro perspective in theory, in our dichotomy here, would be kind of like that sort of like patriarchal viewpoint, but showing it in such a way where you have this husband who is a psychiatrist who is essentially maybe dealing with grief or whatever by dictating to his wife exactly how she should be and what is good and what's not good, and this system of control that he kind of places her into. You know, I really don't think that depicts him in a positive light. You know, I think it sort of shows maybe that the controls that we try to place over kind of like the natural reaction are sort of what drive it to this sort of insanity. That's, I think for that reason, it was really perfect for them to cast him kind of like as a psychiatrist, because like you have this entire history of this profession whose sole objective is to dictate to society what is normal and what's not normal. And I mean, even if you go back into the historical kind of like records of like psychology and stuff like that and go into some of the history behind that, you know, you see that a lot in the Victorian period, where it's clear that the level of stringency and sort of religiously motivated, almost like just to the extreme self-control ends up exploding out of people in really wild ways. When you repress basic emotions, they manifest in dysfunction. And I think that sort of shows maybe kind of in a roundabout way, kind of the poisonous, toxic effect of rampant patriarchy. Like, and I do put a question mark at the end of that, just to kind of like throw that out there and sort of see if that makes sense.
Yeah, and the history of psychology and psychiatry, of course, are rife with misogynistic veins, you know, Freud being an obvious example. But I think I feel a little, I don't think we can have this conversation without at least mentioning the recent Me Too movement and the context in which Bjork, you know, Lars von Trier's former star from Dancer in the Dark, has accused him of sexual harassment. He has denied it. And again, I don't want to necessarily adjudicate that or weigh into that, but given the theme of the film, it would be strange to me to not at least mention it and put that out there, because it's relevant. And a film about a woman who basically just destroys a man, and then he returns the favor, and and then when you read Björk's account of what happens, from her perspective on the set of Dancer in the Dark, it's kind of hard not to see. Again, I'm not necessarily saying that the film makes her account plausible, but there's something going on there. Clearly, this guy has in his head, he's wrestling with and dealing with psychosexual issues and female power and stuff like that. So, again, I throw it out there.
Well, there's only one thing left to do, and that is get Lars on the podcast. I mean, that's clearly what we need to do. Yep, Shaver's got her scissors out. That's oddly horrifying. So we do have a comment that may in our chat that may explain a good amount of what's going on in this film, and it's actually only 5 words, and it says, it's just a comment. It says, "Mother-in-laws are evil." Mother-in-laws are evil. Now that's sort of inarguable, right? Like that's like prima facie true. So how does that play into, you know what I mean? Like how does that play into the idea that women are evil? Very philosophical there. Super Inhuman, is that your name? It's a beautiful philosophical question to ponder, or I should say statement. I got a question for you guys. Why did Charlotte Gainsbourg put the shoes on backwards on her child? Can someone explain that to me?
She hates all men.
I think that may actually be. So then the only thing I could think of is something that, I know you're kind of joking, but like kind of it may be something like that, right?
I think it is. And I think, in fact, like I think she did feel bad about what happened to her child, obviously, but there's one point in the film that makes me wonder, as Garrett pointed out, you don't know what's real or what's not, where we go back in time again to when she was fucking, and it's edited in a way that shows that she was actually watching her son jump from the window and didn't do anything about it. Now, I don't know if she was rewriting history in her own mind to like paint herself as ultimately evil, just out of guilty feelings, or if that was actually the reality of what occurred. But if it is the reality of what occurred, she was a total dick to her son, even if she did love him, and like let him die, and also put his shoes on backwards to make him cry and be in pain. So I don't know. Maybe she wasn't very maternal.
I put in my notes that this was her way of crippling the man, right? That she kind of does a similar thing to her husband when she jams the thing through his leg and makes him unable to move. It's like, I'm going to remove your power.
You're gonna leave me. I know moms that do that to their kids, by the way. They freak the fuck out about their kids leaving home, and
well, the answer is to put their shoes on the opposite way. That's what you need to tell them. This is how you fix the problem.
Well, hold on. Isn't there an old cultural practice in China of foot binding? I think there is something like that where, they would bind the feet of girls so that they would have a harder time keeping balance or like fighting back or like being aggressive in any way.
It was because oh god, it was because small feet were considered sexy, and they didn't want the feet to grow, and one of the culturally desirable male sexual fantasies was for a woman to take a man's penis in between her tiny feet. So that's the origin of that.
You really didn't want to have to say that.
It might have been the most uncomfortable moment in an evening in which I talked about genital mutilation.
I could have said that same thing while putting on my shoes. That would have been amazing. Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. I'm not gonna lie. I have no idea how to segue out of that. So someone jump in. I just have no idea.
Tiny feet sex? What's wrong with tiny feet sex?
Right before they show the picture of the shoes on the wrong way, they had the autopsy, and the picture again of something broken in his foot. I'm assuming the idea is that was what broke his foot. And so yeah, I don't necessarily, again, the theme about trying to cripple the man to cripple her son so her son can't leave him or something like that. I mean, it makes a certain degree of sense, but I also think it's kind of forced. I mean, it's narratively speaking, that felt like a dead end to me. I kind of sort of even forgot about it until you mentioned it, Noah, precisely because it looked like it was going to go somewhere and sort of never went anywhere.
But look what happened when he did try to leave his mom. It's too bad.
Yeah, he was just trying to get some fresh air. Jesus, all been there.
He got what was coming to him in Satan's church. Actually, one of the scenes I don't think we've talked about yet, when they first get to the safe house, when they wake up, he wakes up and his hand is hanging out an open window that wasn't open before, and there was stuff growing on his hand because it was outside in the nature, and nature was taking over with him. And I'm wondering how you guys might have interpreted that, because when I watched it, I was like, the fuck is happening?
Yeah,
what was growing on him? Ticks?
Yeah, they were ticks. Yeah, they were ticks.
Oh,
so it was like, to me, given my clearly superior interpretation of things with nature, it's that nature's quick to take hold, right? That idea of going, like that sort of basic who we are comes out in settings where we're removed from societal norms, and it's sort of like there's that thing there, that monster there. There's actually a great scene. I don't know if you guys have seen the first season of Fargo, not the movie, but the first season of the show Fargo. There is a antagonist in the film. His name is Lorne Malvo. He is he's a killer, essentially a hitman, and he's talking to who's the guy that, oh my god, a famous actor plays Forrest Gump, his son in real life. Can't even think of his name right now. Hanks. Colin Hanks is a cop. And I think he's talking to Colin Hanks in that scene. It could be somebody else, but he basically says to him, he says some weird sort of cryptic statement, something to the effect of, actually, I think the exact statement was, you always want to remind people that you're you occasionally want to remind someone that you're an ape, right? That you still have that power there to just, when all societal things break down, that you can still just pummel the fuck out of somebody, that they can win in all of these other avenues of social convention. But you always have, it's very Bane-esque in a lot of ways. Like if you see The Dark Knight, you see Batman, it's very Bane. It's like, you think this gives you power over me, and Bane simply puts his hand on top of him. And it's like, no, bitch, like all I had to do is put my hand on you. I think this scene is sort of like the power of sort of the visceral and the innate, and how it comes at you very quickly. Like it's his first night there, and all he did is he put his hand out the window and bam, it took over, right? I think that makes sense on my view, because my view is fucking awesome. Just going to throw that out there again for like the 8th time. So
does Lyme disease cause hallucinations? Like, maybe.
Yeah, this is so we're going to do like an ergot thing, like in The Witch, right? Maybe this is remember we had the ergodian interpretation on The Witch. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I also don't know how to segue.
For the record, I do have to say I like your interpretation, Noah. As much as I like everybody else's. I think all interpretations of this film that have been proffered this evening are have a lot to recommend them. So there you go. That's my
but that's you know
that's my anti-ban button.
Yeah, but that's the flip of that, right? So I'll play devil's advocate with myself. That's really my criticism. I had the same problem with Mother when I did my review of Mother. The part of the beauty of Mother and the criticism was one and the same, and that is it's so gray, and we can draw so much from it that it doesn't speak in enough one-on-one way that we can all really go, no, this is really what it's about. And let's have other conversations once we have nailed that down. Like there's an entire strand of other things that we can consider once we all sort of agree that it's obvious that this is what this movie is trying to tell us, right? But we can't really even get there with this film to a certain extent. We can't really get to that place, which is fine. There's still other great conversations we can have like we've been doing tonight. But it's just a different sort of set of conversations that we're having. So that is my criticism of this movie, is that everything was so gray and so artsy and so visual and so thematic and so basic that I kind of wanted more of one thing, maybe just a little bit more of one thing, I guess.
It's the circle of life.
If they would have played that song that would have been it. 10 out of 10 for me. I would have been like, hey, it makes sense now. I now know what this movie's about.
I think that I when you first mentioned Mother, I thought about that earlier today as I was rewatching Antichrist. I think it's clearer with Mother what that film is about. I mean, I think you can draw some more one-to-one comparisons between. Yeah, Noah's reacting on the video, folks.
We need to do a show on Mother, apparently.
Yeah, I think I think Mother's a little bit more.
Now you're banned.
Than this is. Okay, well.
Yeah, now the ban button was a joke. Now I'm looking for it. That's so interesting that you think that. So you actually think that Antichrist was more, let's say, gray, right? Like more gray than Mother, really?
Yes, I do. I definitely do. Yeah, I think Mother is a clear religious allegory, and I think it's very. I think there are almost one-to-one relationships between characters in Mother and Christian mythology. I mean, there's even a Cain and Abel bullshit subplot that happened in Mother.
So, which Eden do you guys prefer?
I think Mother is a little bit more fun and less genital mutilation in Mother.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There's books in Eden in Mother.
Okay, so I didn't know this. Garrett hasn't seen Mother. So yeah, it's not a good Garrett, you know what?
Never mind.
Never mind. Mother is so...
We didn't say anything.
Yeah.
There's no Eden in Mother. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's made by Pure Flix Entertainment. Has a very serious goal. Like, you just know what it is from the... Yeah. Interesting.
I mean, I really, really have to disagree with that. I don't know. Like, obviously, I picked this movie, so I feel like I have like an idea of what it's about. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
But it's called Antichrist. It's called Antichrist, right? So,
I mean, sure. But so, like, subjectively speaking, I definitely see what you're saying. Like, there are definitely like a few different things going on here, but I kind of see it like a rope, right? It's like there's maybe like 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 different strands, and it's easy to kind of tangle them, and maybe there's one and maybe there's the other at certain points. But I think they all sort of weave together to make a coherent whole. Whereas, just to go back to Mother for a second, like just after a certain point, I think that really just blows up, and I don't think there's supposed to be a clear meaning. But that's just me.
Yeah, I think Ben may be my spirit animal in this. That sounded weird. I totally agree.
They are nature.
Yeah, to me, I guess. I'm so far the opposite from Jim on this. I'd almost want to say that this film was in some respects, I guess, theologically couched, very specific even. But in terms of some of the other themes we've been talking about, how to talk about them and draw them out and connect them, very gray. Whereas everything was gray in Mother. I didn't know what was happening. By the third act of Mother, I was like, okay, well, I should just be throwing popcorn at the screen, and that would just add to the cinematic value of the film. Like, it would have made more sense than what was going on in the movie. So I don't know.
Well, we have plenty of fodder for our Mother podcast.
Yeah, now we're gonna have to do Mother. I mean, we did a review. So I did a review, like a quick, 3-minute review of Mother. I basically looked at the camera and said, "It's art, dumbass. Like, don't try to interpret it." Which now we're gonna try to interpret when we do a session on it. But I guess I'll segue over into another issue, which was the violence of this film. So I want to maybe just quickly tackle that for 1 second. This film, to me, was the most violent film we've covered. Viscerally violent, graphically violent. Audition didn't come close to this. That was one of our last films that we did, Audition, and everyone always says, oh, Audition is gore porn. I've had a lot of people say, oh, in fact, part of the fear of me watching this film for years was people said, you're not going to come back from watching Antichrist. That I've had 2 films that people have said that to me. 3. I've had Human Centipede, which was bullshit. That was amazing. I mean, it was a shitty film, but like, I was like, it's like an ass on a mouth. Surprise, surprise.
They eat the poo-poo.
Yeah, I was like, it's nasty, but Centipede was nothing. Antichrist was so much worse than the Human Centipede in terms of the viscerality, the violence, the goal. It's just gross, right? And there were practical effects I learned afterwards in Antichrist, which made it, I think, there's only a couple scenes, but it made it really even worse. So what did you guys think about the violence in this movie? Did it play a role in, like, did it do a service to the film? Did it hurt the film? I've heard both sort of sides. I think Ben maybe had said that it enhanced some aspects of the film. To me, I thought it did too. I thought it made it more in line with my ultimate interpretation of the film, which is a more raw, base, violent, this is in your face sort of appeal. Now, I've heard other critics like Mark Kermode and other folks say that they call it like the "oh Lars." It's like a phrase they use, like "oh Lars." Like, why did you? Of course, you included that. "Oh Lars von Trier." Like, it's just typical Lars to go overboard and be, But I like that. I thought in this film it worked. If we're talking about like such a fundamental thing, if we're talking about base human instinct and nature and removing all idea of convention and just acting on raw fear and emotion and viscerality, of course, we're going to think of sequences of immense pain, and violent, graphic pain. And there were only 2 scenes in which it showed it. It wasn't at all trying to be the focus of the movie. So I thought it enhanced the entirety of the film. I don't think it drug it down in any way. It was unbelievably fucking disgusting. I mean, I'm not happy that I watched a dick cum blood. That was gross. I'm not happy that I watched a clitoris get cut. I mean, it's disgusting. Utterly disgusting.
It looked real, though. Can we just go into the graphic, the special effects? That looked real as fuck. And I gotta say, like, as a person who's seen many of those, it looked like a girl really got cut there. And I appreciate this kind of stuff. I know it's horrible and it causes a reaction, but nothing causes a reaction in me. I watch so many films and I'm like, eh. I actually got up off the couch. Everyone who was here left the room. I was up off the couch and I was literally screaming. And I've seen this film before. It's horrific. And I mean, there's something to be said when you can cause me to actually feel that way, because it's not so common. I mean, I'm not completely numb to things. I'll be like, ooh, that sucks. But it's rare when I'm jumping off of the couch and like, no, stop, no, oh, it's like screaming. Yeah. Like, I don't normally react that way to any film. And it looked so fucking real. There was no point where I was like, that's CGI, or, oh, I can see where the prosthetic is on, or, there's some kind of mix up here. Maybe there is. I didn't notice it. It looked fucking real to me.
But I think also, Shayra, to add to that, right? Like, if you had an entire film where it was that well done, it becomes banal at a certain point and you lose that power. I think what it was is there was so much psychological shit, raw psychological shit, that to like then see the equivalent of that in a physical form and to like really see it in a physical form. I mean, it would be like if someone actually took a camera and cut that off for someone. I mean, it was so real. But I think that the context in which it made it so horrifying was that there were only 2 sequences in this film that had that kind of approach in a context of emotional violence and raw, like, psychosexual violence, right? There's all this other stuff, in other words, that couch the 2 sequences of physical torture and physical pain. And I think that was, like, well done. I don't think it took away from anything. I think it made it enhanced the emotion that you had. I mean, when I saw it, I mean, I don't know if it's because I'm a dude, but I clearly got more of the ow, ew, nasty out of the blood. And she's like wiping it off her. The worst part was like when it happened and she was like, oh, what's this? I was like, oh, that was it for me. It was so nasty. I've seen raw, I've seen body horror. Like, I was like, oh God. Like, do I still got my thing? Jesus. Like,
I kind of feel like I have to provide a counterpoint here. I mean, again, just speaking for me personally, the scene, neither of the scene really hit me. Of those two scenes, I mean, again, part of this I think
that's
is
hardcore,
because
man.
part of this is because I think Jim spoiled the first scene for me, the cock crunching scene. He described the scene to me before I saw it, and I visualized it in my own head much worse than they actually showed it on the film. So that's probably part of it. But to contrast it with the audition, the scene where she cuts off his foot in audition, to this day that fucks me up.
Really? That was worse for you?
That one was incredibly upsetting to me. And while the clitoridectomy definitely looked very, very real, and again, it's upsetting in a sense. I'm not suggesting I was totally cold throughout it, but it didn't hit the heights for me that it did for you. What actually disturbed me a lot more, and something, disturb is too strong a word, but what upset me a lot more was just the sex throughout. I mean, he says it sort of the first time after they have sex, like, like, I'm acting as your therapist now. I shouldn't be having sex with you. Every time they started having sex, I was wanting to fucking scream at them, saying this. I mean, this is the point, right? Is they're not supposed to be doing this, but they're doing it, and it was just an incredibly terrible way for them to process their grief, for a doctor to sleep with his patient, and for him to give in when he specifically realizes this is unhealthy and bad. And, either he can't stop himself or he just chooses not to or whatever. It was frustrating to me and aggravating to me up to the point where when he gets his cock crushed, it's not that he deserved it. It's not that I think, he had it coming or anything like that. But it just sort of, yeah, right. Sorry, I didn't. But he, I
you were like probably sitting up here like, that's what you get.
You had it coming.
It's not that bad, but I lost sympathy for him. Like, I didn't feel, if he'd been an innocent character, or maybe not innocent, but at least sort of sympathetic, I think I would have felt the pain a hell of a lot more. But Garrett, I had such little sympathy.
Garrett, he was coming blood. I mean, empathy on your worst enemy, you don't wish that. Like,
oh no, again, I don't wish it, and again, I don't think he deserved it. But it was harder for me to sort of feel, the mirror neurons.
That says a lot about you, though.
That's really interesting. Wow.
Because it's not necessarily the act, it's what led to it that will affect you more. And I think you saw the character from what was the name of the movie we were just talking about, the Japanese one?
Audition. Yeah,
I think you may have seen him as more innocent then, for it to affect you a little bit more. Although I should say they have a similar theme of keeping a guy from being able to go anywhere. They just have different creative ways of keeping him around.
Yeah. Something wrong with my mic? Is it?
Oh no, you good. You had it going when she was talking. No worries.
Sorry. Okay. So yeah. No, you could definitely sort of psychoanalyze me and my own thoughts on sex in reaction to this. I mean, again, in some ways, you could use this film as something of a Rorschach for a lot of people's sexual psychologies, I think, to see how they react to it. But
yes, tell us all about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, it's like Jim was saying earlier. It's difficult to sort of separate the assessment of the film from your own sort of personal reactions. But
sure,
on this front, I found the way that sex was handled in this film to be, off-putting. And again, that's sort of part of the point, right, of the film. Is that's supposed to be a healthy sexual relationship. But I don't think it inspired in me the reaction that it was quite going for, in such a way that it set up this incredible tension that it did for you guys.
In one of our first podcasts, we had talked about, I think Garrett, you explicitly had talked about Hellraiser and how certain scenes hit you in the mirror neurons. Remember we had discussed that. Hellraiser did that very little for me. This did it way worse than Hellraiser. Like the skin grab hook shit in Hellraiser is like, oh, that's nasty. I didn't say, oh, that's nasty when I saw this scene in Antichrist. I thought, oh my, it hit me in a way that is 100 times worse than any scene in Hellraiser. It's very interesting that we have different takes on that. I don't know. And then I what's really even weirder to that is, maybe to bring us over to Jim, I think you got really sick you threw up or you got sick when you watched Raw, right? Which I was okay. I was a little nauseated when I watched Raw, but I think it's just because I'd eaten some nasty shit before. But I didn't feel great, but I was fine, right? I was fine. This was way worse than anything in Raw. I was like, oh God, if I was eating a corn dog right now, I'd be puking, nasty. Why is there a difference here? One was way more visceral. Raw was nowhere near as visceral. Why do you think there was a difference like that for you? Is it similar to Garrett, where maybe the context plays a role? Maybe some of the storytelling plays a role?
No. For me, it's just I have a thing about mouths, like eating non-food, and that just makes me gag. It just makes me nauseous. It's a individual tick that I don't need to be psychoanalyzed about.
So join us next week as we watch Raw together on the Deadly Analysis podcast, starring Jim.
I mean, I'd be happy to analyze Raw. I thought it was a fine film. But yeah, like that hit me. It like the moments in Raw where she's eating herself and others were a little that made me nauseous. It made me gag. It's just it's a visceral response in me. It's not a psychological in-depth emotion, like fear. Like I wasn't afraid of Raw. Raw didn't scare me. What it did is it made me want to, throw up a little bit. That's all. My response, I agree with you that I think the violence in this film enhanced the overall effect that the film was trying to go for. But this is, I'm going to go back to, I feel like I'm repeating myself for the third time. When she finishes him off and he comes blood and she cuts off her own clitoris, those were moments when that I used to support my thesis that this is a otherworldly, other realmly, other dimension kind of film from me, that it's almost unhuman.
Perhaps it's other dimensional, because if it was of this dimension, the penis violence would just be too much for you.
Perhaps. And once again, we can, Ben's our resident psychologist. I'm sure he's taking notes. and my
wrong kind of psychology, guys. No.
This is why he's choosing the films he is. He's just choosing this to use us as case studies.
Well, what I like about Ben's selection so far, right? Like The Witch, the Babadook to a minor extent, but The Witch, The Seventh Seal, they're all like, there's theological stuff, very Christian theological stuff floating around, and big questions about human nature. One of the things I noted here is that, and we haven't discussed this, I remember going to church, guys, and when I was a Christian, and I was a part of a very distinct evangelical faith that taught that verses like Ephesians 2 that says that Satan is the prince of the power of the air was like meant to basically mean that Satan rules the world, that nature's his domain, and that God's domain is heaven and this other realm that awaits people. So where we're at now, right? Like essentially the world that we live in, that we interact with, that we're engulfed in, the sort of acorns falling, as it were, it's very similar to this film. And there's a weird like reversal in that, because I was taught that by Christians when I was in church, which is really interesting. Take other verses.
I was as well.
Yeah,
it is Satan's church. That's
like, yeah, like it's Satan's world. I think there's a verse in Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, something. It's almost explicitly like Satan is the god of this world, right? And I think that if we take the Noachian interpretation, which is me, I'm Noah, the Noachian interpretation of this.
That is a weird word.
Yeah, it is a very weird word. You can use it. It's a 75-cent word that I'm allowing you to use. I think that it's really weird, and it makes sense in one sense, but it's very reversed in another, because it's the idea, right, that if like nature really is evil and it's bad, Satan owns it and runs it, then this film should kind of be called Christ. Like if you take a very evangelical way of looking at this, this is where I think there's this weird Christian framework that exists in this film that I don't want to jump into this too much, but to go back, I think most of Ben's films have this kind of like Christian framework in which we explore this fundamental issue of the self or the human psyche on the backdrop of Christianity. So look at The Witch. It's a very slow, drawn out, psychological slow burner that is very similar to this. The Babadook is more psychological in nature, but I think also could maybe be about like depression and the human condition and trying to find yourself through it and how to deal with it and handle it. Less theological, but like The Seventh Seal is overtly about asking questions that maybe some of these other two films, like The Witch and this film, dance around, right? Human nature, where do we go when it's all over? Is this it? What is owed between us as a society? There's all these things that sort of dance around Ben's films that I kind of dig. They're very they do it for me. So I'm anxious to see the rest of his films. So far, they've been the ones that I'm like, man, how the fuck have I not seen this? So anyway, Ben, yeah, there's your blowjob for the night. But yeah.
I wanted to quickly throw out one other film, which this did echo in my mind. I'm not sure if you guys have seen the 1981 film Possession with Sam Neill. It explores some similar themes, but it's more about a couple going through a divorce and infidelity rather than the death of a child. But woman goes crazy, man tries to pull her back using reason, doesn't work out too terribly well. All that is in that film too. It's an interesting film. If you like Antichrist, I think you'll probably like Possession. I suspect. But I also wanted to throw out, I don't know if you guys had any thoughts at the very end of the film. It was dedicated to Andrei Tarkovsky. The Russian filmmaker. And I don't know, I mean, I wasn't sure why. I mean, maybe that was just, he was just a fan of his films or something like that. But, Tarkovsky died, I think it was at 86 or something like that. And so it was strange that he dedicated this film of all his films to him. So I assumed there was some sort of connection between this film and Tarkovsky's work, which I wasn't able to pinpoint myself. I don't know if maybe you guys could, or...
I have no idea. I literally was trying to Google it to try and act like I knew what I was talking about while you were talking, but I'm not sure. That's really interesting.
I've got it. It's let me pull up I have it on my IMDb right now. Lars von Trier's trilogy of depression contains extensive homages to the works of Russian filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky. The film features a scene with Willem Dafoe standing quietly in the rain, surrounded by lush scenery, a clear reference to the opening scene of Solaris, 1972. So perhaps that sheds some light on things. I suspect that this is certainly that Tarkovsky is certainly a filmmaker that von Trier has admired for quite some time.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I guess that's easy enough.
Yeah. Do you guys have anything else you want to add about the film before we wrap it up?
Well, we were discussing Mother, and house guests, and them. I guess with that film, it's about, and I won't go too much into it, Garrett, but we went into about like how house guests, they're going to cause this chaos in the safe place. I feel like there is some overlap to this film with the nature trying to go into the safe place. But we actually did something opposite. And I'm actually going to blame Ben for this. We did something opposite. We had nature come into my home, my safe place, and I violated them in a way, but it was actually Ben because of his movie choice. I had house guests over and watched this film with them, and you really messed with them, Ben. They were walking all over the house. At one point, Harley was yelling down the hallway. She's like, "I love you, honey. I love you." And he's like, "I love my penis." And like, I feel like this is one of those films that really affects everybody. You know what I mean? It causes you to physically go, no, I don't like this. And Harley has some words for you, Ben. I'm going to let Harley say some words to you.
Hey, Ben. Nice to meet you. So, interesting first impression, by the way.
I do what I can. It's good to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here. It's definitely an interesting start as far as movies go. And actually, we were talking about this group as far as horror movie critiques, because it's an unusual choice. So my first thought when I was watching the film was, fuck you, God. Because that was, it's definitely a horror film, but it's a different type. It's a horrific reality type of film. And then it goes into that whole dream of, satanic religion. Goodness. It's
Yeah,
a lot to
you
take.
fucked her up. You fucked her up, Ben. You messed her up. Damn it.
There are
Damn it.
definitely some nope moments with it. I kind of forced myself into watching the rest of it just to get the holistic view of what was going on, because you never know what's going to be explained or what's going to be left. Like the sort of questionable ending of the overwhelming amount of femininity walking through the forest after just killing his wife, the one feminine kind of persona in his life that he just destroyed, and now he's consumed by all this female presence. It was kind of overwhelming. It was gave a lot of thought, more than the possessive slasher type genre of horror. So
That's perfect. That's really what I was going for when I picked this, because it is horrific and it got me emotionally more than any slasher that I've ever seen. You know, it's better than any Rob Zombie film. It's better than, you know, kind of like the old Mike Myers and like, you know, Jason Voorhees. I think absolutely, because all it really does to evoke horror is, I think, kind of eliminate human illusions of basic nature. And I think there's really a beauty in that, just to go beyond kind of like the one or two scenes that are just absolutely insanely graphic.
sorry, just making sure I had everything unmuted. Yeah, I think it's kind of, as deep as it was kind of refreshing to have a different take on things. I'm always looking for different creativity, especially when it comes to psychological films, because there's so much that he was able to use and tap into. It was like he was using a tool that he didn't realize how big. It was like using Pandora's box. Like when you learn a lot about psychology, there's this whole tool that you don't realize how dangerous it is to use. I mean, whether you're going to use it for good or evil, there was definitely a huge fine line for what he was trying to do. He didn't realize how much he'd breached it. And in his view, he was using it for the good of the feminine person in his life. But it really showed how much you can push that boundary and destroy a being with their vulnerability.
Yeah, I would definitely call his actions an abuse of authority. I guess you could speculate whether or not that was just his form of grieving, was to try and exert his power over the situation and impose kind of like rules and regulations on it. But yeah, absolutely. I love this interpretation. Do you have a psychological background, or have you studied psychology?
No, I actually haven't. It's something I'd want to look into, but I absolutely find the human mind fascinating. There's a lot that people don't understand, that how different everybody is. I think there's this societal look at people that we're all the same, even though we're taught we're different. Kids, you know, there's black people and there's white people, there's females and there's guys, there's this. It's still, they don't understand how I want to say stark that view is. It's very blocky. And after getting to know different types of people and learning about different personalities, growing up, becoming an adult, trying to get friends or just talk to different people, if you really just listen, you find out how much everybody's mind just expands and grows. And as somebody who works with children, actually watching this film and being someone who work with children, you really understand how much this kind of fucks people's minds over this whole situation. And then just watching the situation in general, I've been taught, or I've observed how much people's neural pathways just branch together and expand by listening to different things and observing. And so I've seen, it's just, the key is just to be observant. I mean, observe people, observe how people change in your life. This is how people grow apart. This is how people grow together. This is how societies are formed and religions are formed by that, just by how people grow. So I think just by me observing that has caused me to have more of that, yes, psychological background and observance. But I would definitely consider learning more. I mean, I think it's fascinating. I think it's valuable.
So just to steer it back, and I ask you overall, would you say did you like Antichrist as a film? Would you recommend it to people?
To friends that I have, I'd say no. Just because they're all moms. They're moms this is their greatest fear. I mean, if I want to say you really want to see something scary, then I say watch this movie. But this is really something I do to an enemy. I was joking with someone. I said, you know what? If you really have an enemy, just tell them, yeah, you know it's a good movie to get high to? Just this great movie. It's got great visuals. It's very psychological. It's one of those things that just takes you deeper if you really want this. That's a really cruel joke, but as far as liking it artistically, I did. I liked how it was filmed. I liked how everything was portrayed in such a light that made sense. Like the sex in the beginning, to the dreams, to her on her knees in the bathroom, just having that breakdown after her child has died and going through a depression. It was perfect to me. I guess perfect is too.
No, that's the right word. That's the right word. I would completely agree with you.
I would say I like it in a very I don't know what word to say. It's a different sense. I like it in an artistic view, is what I would say.
It's hard to like. It's hard to like something so awful, isn't it?
It is. As I was watching the movie, I was telling Shara, I said, I like it, but fuck no. It's awesome, but it's disgusting at the same time. It's not an entertainment movie, I would say. It's more of an art film.
Yeah,
it's used for.
Go ahead. I was gonna say that reminds me of something that David Fincher once said that I really liked. He said, "I'm not sure how much movies should entertain. Personally, I'm much more interested in movies that scar."
Okay. Yeah. I think that's an interesting view as far as filmmaking goes. I mean, I've always been in the point where, as somebody who, I went to musical theater school, but I really wanted to do it just to have extra background as far as if I was in films, to have different things that I could do, whether it isn't for artistic reasons. I wanted to be able to perform in whatever way the director needed me to perform. But I think as far as filmmaking goes, I always had the view of making films for artistic reasons, because they impact people in many different ways that people don't understand. I think it's one of those, it's just like looking at a painting to me. I mean, but man,
this was a really fucked up painting.
Really. It was a really fucked up painting, but it's like looking at it's the only way that you can tell somebody how you see something is by showing them in a way. And that director did a really good job portraying that to me.
Yeah.
I have to say, I completely agree with that. I would never in a million years suggest this to anyone who I actually know in real life. Like, I think this is really good for this show because it is one of those very rare works that I think does function as kind of a mirror, and that's sort of the goal here, right? So, we look at these movies that I think are supposed to show us something about ourselves, and I think this is something that's really good at doing that. But if I would I ever go to work and be like, hey man, you should really watch this, Antichrist film, it's awesome? No.
Tell your boss.
No way in
Tell
hell.
your boss. Yeah.
No way in hell.
Well, let's.
Tomorrow's the first day of school. Should I tell my students?
Yeah. Well, thank you for your input. It's cool to hear someone else's. We all kind of have a little bit of an echo chamber with Shayra and all of us. Like, we all kind of know each other pretty well after doing these film analyses together, like with different types of horror films over the last year. So it's good to have an outsider come in and be like, "Hey, so fuck you for making us watch that." That's really awesome. So I really appreciate you hopping on and giving your opinion. Thank you.
Of course. No, thank you for just the opportunity to join and talk about it. I always find an excuse to discuss something that is more than just the American crowd-pleasing movie. So,
well, thanks for hopping in. Yep.
Of course.
All right, so let's score this movie. Let's get Shayra back in here and score the movie. I kind of want to do something different for from here on out in our podcast. I'll actually wait till Shayra pops in her headphones. So let's do something different. Let's score from now on. Instead of doing, I was thinking about this, instead of scoring our stuff, how scary it is to you, and then also on a scale of 1 to 10, how good it is, let's just do 5 stars from now on. That's what I want to do from now on. Are you guys down with that? I know that's kind of a
Are you doing like Netflix where they're going to eventually just go to up or down?
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, Jim Sappy. I want to make sure you guys. Ben looks like he's going to stab me, which is
my question is: if we're going to change how we rate it, is someone going to go in and do the math to adjust our original?
I have an algorithm. I have an algorithm that will do this.
You can just multiply by 2.
Yeah, like, that's the algorithm. The algorithm is divide. Yeah, that's it. So I'm gonna. So with that in mind, and so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna rate this film cinematically 5-star, and then I'm gonna talk about how scary it was. I don't want to rate how scary it was. I want to kind of give you maybe on my scale how scary it was. So I'll start by saying, yeah, Ben opposes this system. All right, Ben is a maverick. But this is his film, so of course Ben's going to be a maverick. All right. This film scared me a lot. It scared me more than I thought it was going to. I went into this thinking I ought to be scared because I'm going to see a dick cum blood, and that's nasty. That's gross. I don't want to see that. I don't want to see scissors. Ooh, nasty. There's a visceral reactive. I don't want to watch this. But when I ended up watching it, I was caught. I think that helped because I was caught off guard by the psychological, by sort of the weird. Let's return element to this. Let's return to a kind of fundamental Eden and reverse everything. Let's give you a new lens to look at Eden. And as a person who was a devout Christian for a very long time, it was very intriguing to me to think about it that way, to look at the Garden of Eden as a place that Satan created, not a place that God created. And to look at this, I typically hate artsy films, like artsy horror films, especially, just bother me. They bug me. They don't go together to me. But this did it all right. It really made me think about fundamental things, and that's all I ask for in a horror movie. What makes a horror movie good to me is that you strip away shit that's not important, and you ask a fundamental question that has a scary answer about what it means to be human, about our place in society, about the way we have relationships, about the fact that we're not going to be people at a certain point in our life, we're going to die at a certain point. You pose these questions that are always in the background of our human psyche, manifest them, contextualize them, and do them in a way that makes them the focus, not necessarily a doll with a knife coming to stab you, right? I mean, it's for a little bit of a simplistic way of looking at it. I think you could go into a little more depth for some of those films, like inanimate objects coming to life. I think there's shit there, there's psychological shit there. But the point is, this film made me think about things that are really scary in real life, guys. Like not even the visceral shit. It just made me think about, like, what does it mean? Like, what if chaos really reigns and all of this shit is an illusion and there's really no one behind the curtain, and all of our conventions and stuff, that if we remove them and we're in a raw state of fear and panic, what would I do? I mean, I certainly don't think I would do anything like that's in this movie, but it makes you think about shit that's uncomfortable and unsettling. And it gives you a lens of, depression to look through them. And that's so atypical for movies. You know, that's so, our other co-host, Ben Carruth, had said something to the effect that horror is one of those few genres. In a previous podcast, I think it was our Triangle podcast, said that horror is one of those few genres that he enjoys because it's a wider canvas that allows for more artistic creativity to explore these sorts of issues. It's more okay to use the canvas of horror to ask these sorts of questions and to think about these sorts of fundamental base concepts and to explore them. And I think Antichrist did that brilliantly. So if I had to rate Antichrist overall, I'd probably give it, if we're going out of 5 stars, I'd probably give it 3.5 stars. And I should probably, that's high on a 5-star scale to me. I should have never changed this rating. Why did I do this? I'm realizing how I failed in the midst of changing it.
You just gave it a 7.
I just gave it a 7.
Fine.
Yeah, that works. That works. The
3.5 stars is a 7.
Yeah, the algorithm has worked. Thank you, ×2. But
wait,
yeah,
I don't understand math. I don't get it.
Yeah.
Just joking.
But I do want to thank Ben because this film really did scare me. I mean, it, in a year, we've been doing this podcast for a year, and the other film again that I hadn't seen up until this point that did it for me was Sunshine. How Sunshine left me claustrophobic, this film left me unsettled about what it means to be a human person in times of grief. And and it threw a religious context in there for me to muddle those concepts around and to play with them and think about them. Very interesting, very intellectual, very unsettling, and brutally graphic. And I think that brutally graphic was a nice pinch of salt in there for me to make everything even out. You don't want to be too intellectual. You don't want to be too fundamental. You don't want to make things too cerebral. You want to have that nice, oh, that shit was nasty part in it too. And this film did it for me. So one of my favorite films that has been recommended so far. And I'm so fucking happy that this film was recommended. So thank you, Ben. So that's my spiel for the film.
So I'm gonna sort of take you on the sort of the reason why I've proffered the thesis that I've proffered as sort of a backup for my rating. My first Lars von Trier film was Breaking the Waves, and I absolutely loved it. Emily Watson, Stellan Skarsgård. It's an incredible film that really captured me, and I was on the Lars von Trier, whatever. I was on that train. The next film I saw, I think, was Dancer in the Dark. And once again, I liked it, but there were things that I started to have some problems with. I started to see this grim worldview sort of overtake his films, but there was enough creativity and enough interesting things going on in the film that made me, that kept me on the train. Dogville, same thing as Dancer in the Dark. And then I hit Antichrist, and this was the film where it turned for me. This was the film when I felt like Lars von Trier started to just jump the shark, and that the overwhelming otherworldliness of his worldview, and the depression associated with his worldview became a little bit too much. Then I saw Melancholia. Once again, really creative things going on in the film. I liked it, but the worldview was, once again, this is a man who seems in his films like he has never felt an inch of happiness in his entire life. And then Nymphomaniac was when 5 hours of Nymphomaniac in a day, and that was I was done. And that's why it was sort of, at the end of it, I was like, okay, Lars von Trier exists in a world that is unrelated to my own and has no longer been able to comment on my own. I will accept many things when I come into a film. Okay, we're on a spaceship and we're going to Mars. Got it. Fine. A doll has come to life and starts to stab people. Got it. Okay, I'm good. But there's something about Antichrist, and there's something about his other films, Nymphomaniac, etc., that just it takes it a bridge too far for me, and that's the reason why it doesn't affect me anymore. It has almost become a Human Centipede effect where I'm seeing really gruesome things, but it's no longer having a relationship to me. It's no longer having a relationship to the world that I live. There are far more disturbing films. I mean, even Audition, I could see the way in which that was a reflection of the world in which I live, and therefore it had more of an effect on me. And that's where Antichrist sort of jumped the shark. Now, once again, cinematography, artistry, themes, some of the writing, all very good. So for that reason, I'm going to skew middle. I'm giving it 3 stars, and in terms of scariness and effectiveness, well, I mean, I've talked for the last 2 hours about the effective scenes of this film, so I won't rehearse that. So that's my overall summation of the film, and it's basically because I see Antichrist in the context of all of his other films. I almost wish that he had made like a romantic comedy, like a dumb romantic. I almost wish that he's just not that into you in the middle, so that I would have had a break. So that and maybe that would have even made this a more effective film for me. So that 3 stars, and I'll toss it to the next person.
I'll go. Oh, go ahead, Garrett. It's fine. I'll go last. That'll be fun. Or as Ben will go last. We know what his is probably going to be, though.
Yeah, no, I mean, mine's pretty simple and straightforward. I give it a straight, flat down the middle, 2.5 stars. I think that, again, the cinematography, the editing, all that stuff is fantastic. The themes are very, very interesting. But the characters, the story, that did nothing for me. So it smack dab in the middle. It's in many ways, I think it's a shame that you couldn't have had such beautiful images and such interesting themes told with a film that did justice to that incredible artistry. So I'm smack in the middle, 2.5.
All right, I'll go. I am the probably almost what you would consider opposite of what Garrett is. I'm gonna go full 5 with this motherfucker. This is the first time I've gone a full 5 with a film. But I should put some background into this. I was told shortly after I had Kylie, when I wanted to try to have another child, I was told that I was completely infertile and I couldn't have any more children. I had a room set up in my house, and I spent about a week crying in a room by myself. The scenes where she was experiencing grief of a loss of a child really spoke to me on a level that I cannot even try to explain to other people. When she's like obviously in physical pain from crying so hard, to the point where you start to get physically violent with yourself from crying so much that you just don't want to feel pain from crying. So you want to feel pain from something external. Your body will force yourself to do that. Like your body actually purposely harms itself after being in that cry fest for a long period of time. There's weird things that you just have no control over. So it spoke to me, and it told me that the person who made this film or wrote this film or even acted as that part, they know what I've been through. They've stepped in my shoes and they've perfectly portrayed it in an artistic way. It spoke to me on a huge level. Now, when we get to going out to the cabin and we have the safe space analogy, which is, a huge analogy that we should take into consideration for, especially today. We have the external forces of the world outside and the thing that we try to control. And you have a point where the man is trying to light a fire and it won't even light in his home. It's the external stuff is just going deep within you, and your safe space is just gone and you have no control over that. And I feel like it just speaks to me. Like, I feel like I've been there. I feel like I've experienced this, and it spoke to my fears of losing a child or not having one. It spoke to what I've gone through with grief and depression at times. Also the idea of your body being broken. I feel like she expresses that perfectly. I've been in that situation where I don't want to get too intimate with myself, but I've been in situations where I've been intimate with a guy and talked about how, I feel broken and like something's wrong with me because of dealing with the grief. And she's doing that throughout the whole thing. Now, I don't know what Lars has done to women. I don't know what his background is. But I feel like someone he knows or someone who helped in making this film has experienced something I've experienced. And it truly spoke to something that is a deep, deep fear. And then also seeing it looks like a real clit getting chopped off. Holy fuck. It's just horror across the board. Like if you wanted to write the scariest movie for me, that would be the perfect film. That being said, I loved it. As much as it hurt to relive those things, which actually watching it the second time, I realized I blocked a lot of it out. So I watched it again. I'm like, oh yeah, fuck this. But it was so good. And I think it's important to have art express things we felt that has hurt us so that we know that we're not alone. And in a way that makes it not so chaotic, right? Like someone else has been here, not just me. So I guess it makes me feel not alone as much as the movie made you feel like you're isolated. It made me feel like someone understands me. So as much as it might have depressed Jim, it kind of made me feel hopeful. As fucked up as that may sound.
So a couple things before we shoot over bed. One is it's crazy to hear that it's not crazy to hear. It's cool that a film has that sort of immediate impact on you, that experiential impact. Secondly, a 10 out of 10 is like I think the highest we've had. So I'm putting that under Ben's notch there. 10 out of 10 from Shayra, which is crazy. The other thing, Shayra, is I noticed that in the films that scare you the most, when we think of Invasion of the Body Snatcher and some of the other ones where you've really wigged out on, there's always this idea of being taken over by the next, like being assimilated, right? But in this one, it's the complete reverse, and it's still that same fear. It's like the flip side of the same coin, right? It's that like, well, okay, if I have a kid, there's a sense in which that child replaces me. I die, and they're a little Shayra, right? On the other end, if I can't have any little Shayras, I don't have that potential. I'm going to die as just me, and there's no little Shayra. So it's a real double-edged sword, and I find it so very interesting that both of the sides of the same coin seem to really scare the shit out of you. We should explore that in further films. I think
it's called motherhood.
Yeah. It's like I was gonna say, it's like really personal, and it's motherly and personal, but it's why we started this podcast. It's like why are these things so scary to you? They're not scary to me. Yet at the same time, just sitting down in a room and going like this and thinking about non-existence will make me not sleep for 3 days, right? And it doesn't do that for Garrett or someone else. It's really interesting that we have such fundamental fears that are brought out by such different films that are completely the opposite, but maybe the flip side of the same coin in this sort of scenario for you. So I find that really cool, really interesting, really cool. I hope it's not weird to say it's cool, but really interesting.
It is cool. And the thing is I wouldn't even say that it scared me as much as it fucking triggered me. Like, I think it violated me. I'm kind of glad it did, because it helps you work through some of your demons within you, right? But it did feel like a violation, I guess I got ticks on my hand. I don't know.
Yeah. Thanks, Lars, if you're watching this. All the directors who make these films clearly watch our show. So thanks, Lars. Thanks. Why don't you close us up, Ben? Give us your rating. Ben's rating may not be as high as Shayra's. Let's see how this ends. This is interesting.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know how I can really follow up on what Shayra just described. I think it's really interesting if you go to Rotten Tomatoes, for instance. I think the ratings there are fairly consistent with what we've seen across the show. Middling, right? Like 55%-ish. And then you have myself who, watched this and was like, okay, well, this really speaks to me. And then you have Shayra who probably felt an even more personal connection to it than I did, rating it very high. So, again, I think this is probably a perfect example of something that you can find that as a work of art, it's going to show something within yourself, but uniquely speaking, perhaps if maybe it's meant to reflect a particular kind of thing. And if that particular kind of thing maybe isn't there, then maybe it's just not going to resonate as much. I don't know. There's something really interesting about this movie. And because of that, you know, I'm going to give it what would have been a 9.5. So I guess it's going to be a 4.75 now. I didn't break down whenever I watched this movie the way that I did with Seventh Seal. It made me think, it made me feel like it really got to me in a way that no slasher movie ever has. There's a lot to this, I think, that is important. And I think I do kind of probably more understand why I enjoyed this so much now. And it's awesome. I love it so much that it spoke to somebody else on our cast, even if it was personal and painful, and a little bit deeper than, you know, maybe if we were having just sort of like polite conversation that two people might want to go, right? But you know, but this is something I think heavy and dense, and important, right? You know, it's not something that I would just sort of pass around and say, okay, well, yeah, this is a fun flick, you know, go watch this flick. Oh, you know, you'll get a little bit scared. It's kind of fun. You know, there's something here. There's real substance here. And that's why I really like this movie. You know, maybe I don't have the context of like the director. I haven't seen any of his other work. Maybe that would change things, but this in isolation, I just think was awesome. All around, you know, obviously I think it would get, you know, somewhere close to a 10 visually, and it would obviously it gets close to a 10 emotionally. But I think before I described my criteria is like to get above 9, like it really has to speak to you, and to be 10, there was that bar set where it destroyed me, almost. So yeah, man, like this really gets up there. Yeah, I like I said, like I really can't go into it and do it justice the way that other people might have been able to. But share it as your friend discussed. You know, this I guess is sort of like a Pandora's box, right? You know, it's like you have this thing, and you don't really know, you know, what do you do with it, right? But I think it is an important film that people who are into that kind of thing probably should give a shot.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if you're a remotely thoughtful person and you enjoy horror films that make you think, I would definitely recommend this one, but I would temper it with a little bit of, you know, I would tell my friends that watch this that kind of be ready, like be prepared. If you're a fairly thoughtful person, this is going to make you think of things. This is going to do work when the film is over. You're going to sit there and go, either something's going to happen to you or just nothing's going to happen to you, you know? Anyway. Yeah, I'm so glad we did this film. I have literally had it in my queue for years to watch at the recommendation of other folks that like horror films. And the odd thing is, Ben, that most of them were like, you should watch it because it's so graphic. And that wasn't even, that was so dumb. I'm going to write all of those people a strongly worded letter and say, you are all fools, all of you. How dare you? That was the wrong reason. So thank you guys for joining us tonight for this. Join us next week. Well, I'm sorry, not next week. We're taking 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks, 2 Sundays from now, we will be doing probably the most horrific film we've ever done, which is The Lion King. That will be the next film we do. No, I'm just kidding. The next film we do will be a film called Excision, which is not very well known. It's long story short, it's about a very disturbed sociopathic high school student with hopes to be a doctor. Just leave it at that. What could go wrong? What could go wrong, right? Sounds like a Disney film on acid, you know? So join us in 2 weeks for that. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I am proud to say, guys, that as of last week, we are officially on iTunes and on Stitcher. So if you have Android, check us out on Stitcher. You have an iPhone, God help you, but you can check us out on iTunes. Android for life. So yeah, check us out on our social media. If you liked what you saw, like, subscribe, leave us a comment. We'll get back to you with any messages you send us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in a couple weeks for Excision.